All right. So I just wanted to take a minute. We're going to be transitioning from reading reconsidered into the writing rope. And I thought I would take a minute. This is absolutely probably my favorite thing to teach, but also my favorite part of teaching English language arts is probably going to be the biggest challenge that you're going to face. And I think that's what I love about writing is its complexity. But I wanted to take a minute and have just share a little bit about what I've come to understand through my research and experience about writing and adolescent learners. So let's just go through a couple of ideas that I think will be important. We're going to begin by looking at this model of writing. It's called the writing rope. And what I like about the writing rope is you can see that each of the components are separate, but really our object or what we really want to do is move it into so that it's tightly braided together, right? So we don't tease out any one part of it and it becomes simultaneous. And that's important because when we have writing that is problematic from our students, when they're not able to meet our expectations, we probably want to spend some time to see which thread do we need to pull on, right? It's very unlikely that we need to pull on all of the threads at once. I also want to point out that, we're going to spend a little bit of time. We won't really read the chapter, but I do want to point out that there is all the way down to transcription, right? And as weird as it sounds, one of the things that I think I have found is that transcription actually has become more of a barrier as we've gotten more used to technology. And so, one of the things I want you to really consider is how you're using technology in the classroom for your writers. And if sometimes it would be useful to actually have them do writing on with pen and paper, but also be conscious of the fact that that actually might complicate it in a very different way. I know for myself personally, I used to write a lot on pen and paper with pen and paper, and I don't as much. And so it slows the process down, which can have value, but it might also complicate the process. So I want you to think about those choices. Yes, we're not teaching spelling and handwriting or keyboarding, but sometimes spelling and handwriting become a real barrier for our students, even at the high school level. So we want to think about whether or not that is an appropriate step. I'm not saying it's never an appropriate step. I actually think there are times when asking them to write it out is important, especially if we want to work on having them sort of think through an idea, or if we want to have them process the idea so that they can move to their memory. But you'll also see, I'm sure you'll see lots of components of a rubric. If you're working in a school that has a writing rubric, I wouldn't be surprised if these skilled writing components are part of that rubric. And I just want you to take this in for a minute and think about just how amazing it is that any of us can write effectively given the complexities. When you actually think about what is the number of decisions that a student has to make and what is behind really good writing. So why do we teach writing? Well, part of the reason we teach writing is it is a very complex process that allows us to really learn something deeply. So when we write, this is a graphic that sort of tries to go through what a working memory looks like. And one of the things that you will notice, right, is that the arrows go back and forth. Basically, once we get something, we see something, we move it into what's called our conscious awareness. And from our conscious awareness, we either, because of our executive function allows us to pay attention to it, we pay attention to it and we move it into our working memory, or we let it go and we pay attention to the next thing, right? But one of the things that you should know is we don't automatically, just because we see or hear something, we actually don't automatically learn it, memorize it. What has to happen is this thing that they call the inner voice. There has to be some working with the arrows going back and forth, the input and the conscious awareness and what they call the inner voice. There has to be this conscious awareness back and forth so that the students are grappling with ideas, and that grappling is really how we move it from that conscious awareness, that short-term memory, into our long-term memory so that we can think about it. And that long-term memory can be long-term memory that are factual, It also can be about big ideas and helping our students to begin to think about their understandings of life, their philosophies of their moral ideas, their moral compass. So there's a lot of good reasons for us to work with writing, because writing is part of that middle step in moving something from input into our long-term memory. Writing is a very effective way to make our students become consciously aware and move that idea back and forth between the idea, the input, and the inner voice, so that we move it from our conscious awareness into our long-term memory. What we do know too is, and this is something that's very important, is that writing actually helps us to learn. I think it's because of this model, right? We have lots of evidence that shows that when we want students to know something, we should take time and have them write about it. Okay. So this is true across. And so when you are in a situation where you can advocate for writing across the curriculum, I think it's important for us to recognize, no, we don't want everybody to become a writing teacher. That's kind of our job as ELA people, right? We become the writing teachers for sure. But we do want everyone to use writing, because writing is such an effective way to move students through that process of taking input and putting it into their long-term memories. What we know about writing comes from, a lot of what we know about our cognitive model of writing comes from Flower and Hayes. And they were researchers in the 1980s. They did a very simple thing where they had writers do think alouds. They record them writing, and through their think alouds, they really kind of identified what we talk about as the writing process now. And so in their model, they talk about the task, which means the rhetorical problem that we give them, and maybe what their text produced so far, like sometimes like notes or research or things like that. And you notice again, the arrows are back and forth because this is a iterative and discursive process. We keep moving. You don't neatly move through the planning process. You actually go back and forth and back and forth. Okay. But what we know is that students can go from, they move from what they bring in, which they have from their own long-term memory, their knowledge of the topic, their understanding of audience, which many students may not actually be thinking about, and their awareness about different styles. So you might sometimes have to explicitly teach them to think about their audience or to think about awareness of style. And that's where using things like model text come into handy, maybe talking about vocabulary in terms of diction and connotation and things like that. But we bring that to our cognitive model. And in our cognitive model, what we have is our students, we know that our students are planning, they're generating ideas, they're organizing, they have goal set, this is what they want to accomplish, right? Sometimes that goal comes from us, or part of that goal comes from us through a well-written prompt. But what happens then is they have to translate it, they have to draft it, they have to think about what that planning looks like in practice, right? And then they go back and they evaluate and they edit. And this is a process that is very messy. While this maybe looks like it's linear, it's really not. If I was to draw it, I'd draw it arrows back and forth, and it would be really, really messy. But as teachers, we have the ability to monitor throughout the process. So the worst thing in the world a teacher can do is assign an assignment and then only look at the final draft, right? If we really want to learn and really want to teach our students, we need to learn what they need, and teach our students, we need to be monitoring throughout. One of the things that we have to think about is writing is partly complex, because we often think of writing as this abstract, what do I say, like personal process that we go through, but really writing is about communicating. And so writing done really well is about helping students to understand that writing is about communicating their ideas and thoughts in ways that others can respond to it and value it. And so we need to help students to understand that they have to consider the perspective of the audience. And that seems kind of duh 101, but it's amazingly difficult for some students. Flower and Hayes, well, actually, I believe it's just Jennifer Flower. Also, the people that came up with Linda Flower also came up with the idea of what we call writer-based prose. And this is a natural process. Beginning writers, I'm going to read this to you. Beginning writers often find it difficult to work between public and private writing, or what Linda Flower calls writer-based and reader-based prose. That is, writer-based prose is a verbal expression written by, to, and for the writer that reflects the associative action of the mind when verbally relating a topic. We can and do often write for ourselves. We might write notes in our phones, like, that remind us things. We might write ideas in the margins of a text. Those are writer-based prose, okay? Such prose is typified by any references to the self, is loaded with code words, those known only to the writer, and usually is linear in format. Reader-based prose, on the other hand, deliberately attempts to address an audience other than the self. It defines coded terms, so it helps us to understand, like, context. So the example I might use is, if you've ever read a stream of consciousness book, it's very difficult, in part because we're not given context. An idea crosses the character's mind, and the idea is presented as if it's happening in real time when it could be a thought. What a reader-based prose would do would be contextualize it. I found myself thinking about, and then sharing that idea out, right? So that's the difference between a writer-based prose, where you might just have the idea out there, and a reader-based prose where you contextualize the idea so that they can see, this is just a thought I had, right? And where was I when I had that thought, or what triggered that thought? It refers less to the writer and is structured around the topic. In its language and structure, reader-based prose reflects the purpose as in the writer's thought, rather than its processes in the writer-based prose. So it's important that we allow and offer space for our students to engage in writer-based prose, because it's natural, and it actually is a way for us to work through our ideas, right? What we want to bring to the planning process. But the planning process of academic writing will help us move from writer-based prose to reader-based prose. Knowing, though, that for some students, that's a big leap, especially when they're attending to all of those things. When you think about the things in that first slide, all of the things that a person has to pay attention to, it can be overwhelming. It's a very, very challenging cognitive demand that we ask of our students. And that's why you'll start to see some examples of scaffolds, right? Where we offer models and structures for our students so that we can take away some of the decision making that they have to, or ease that decision making, I guess I should say, so that they don't feel overwhelmed, right? Paralysis by analysis. And so that's when you see, this is an example of a very common scaffold that you'll see in the classroom, where you'll have a way to kind of, like, what do I want to say? Trigger for readers, or for your students, the purpose of the writing. So RAFT: assume a role, consider the audience, choose a format, and write a topic. RAFT is one acronym. You'll see RACE, you'll see a couple of others, and we'll go through some throughout this reading of the writing route. But do understand that it's not to say that these are the end all be all, but what it does is it helps us, for our readers that are really trying to move out of the writer-based prose and into reader-based prose. And the last thing I want to tell you is that writing is an extremely personal process, because it seems so subjective to because part of that, much of that writing is what we bring, right? Our ideas, our background, our understandings. Writing is personal in a way that many of the other things that we do with our students is not. And we need to approach writing where we honor the personal, even as we try to move students to meet our demands. And that's why I think it's really important that we are engaging with our students throughout the writing process, that we're giving them an opportunity to learn from their mistakes, right? That they're drafting with us, that they're getting feedback from us. Because when we assess writing, it's really important for us to be conscious of the fact that for some students, it feels like we're assessing their thinking more than we're assessing their writing. And so helping them to see that we value what they're saying, even when we need to correct how they're writing it, I think that's a really important balance for us to draw. All right, that's it for this week. I'll stop sharing here for a second. I just wanted to give that sort of background as you start into the writing rote. which is going to help us to think about how to help all of our writers. And you'll find that some of your writers will be way beyond, right? And what I always say is we have to help our students understand the rules before they intentionally break them. And so writing instruction becomes very personalized, because you're going to find that some students are very natural reader-based writers and others are not. And we need to meet our students where they are and help them. And so we've got to create some universal expectations and universal scaffolds, knowing that as our students grow, they can start to move away from those. I'm not a big fan of just teaching the 5-paragraph essay and saying it's gospel, but sometimes beginning with a 5-paragraph essay so that they can understand when they might want to move away from it is important.